Brooklyn really and truly loves Noah. However, she dreads going to his home and interacting with his parents. Mr. and Mrs. Clark are typical arrogant rich people who treat other people as though they are beneath them, especially those whose way of life is significantly different from theirs. They act as if they have always been living that way, when in fact they suddenly got wealthy 3 years ago, much to people's utter surprise. One day 3 years ago, Mr. Clark came home with a lot of cash, like a lot. But no one knew where it came from. He said he was able to close a deal with a big client, and although people knew he was not a savvy businessman, they brushed it off. It wasn't their business anyway. But it was just then that Mr. and Mrs. Clark started living as if everyone was beneath them. Brooklyn, a simple and humble medical student, is the person their son loves, but they can't seem to accept that. For them, the young couple aren't for each other for the simple fact that they have different social statuses. Although when you see them, you wouldn't really know if you didn't take a closer look at the designer logos on what was otherwise simple clothing worn by Noah. He exudes quiet wealth, while Brooklyn, always neat and prim, seems like she comes from a wealthy family as well. One day there was a celebration at the Clark household. Obviously Noah invited Brooklyn. Although hesitant, Brooklyn decided to go as a sign of respect for her boyfriend's parents. At the dinner table, Mrs. Clark kept asking Brooklyn 2 personal questions that shouldn't be asked with other people present. Well, actually, she intentionally did that so she could either embarrass or degrade her son's poor girlfriend. As Mrs. Clark kept pressing her for answers she'd rather not share, as they are really too personal a topic, she thought to herself, just be patient with her. She's Noah's mother and you love Noah. You can endure this for him. She did this several times as Mrs. Clark didn't seem to notice how uncomfortable she was. Well, maybe she did, but she didn't care anyway. Brooklyn always knew that Noah's parents didn't like her for their son. She's too poor for him, and there's a better, richer girl more suited to their golden boy. But she loves Noah so much that she decided not to dwell on it, and just show up when need be and show his parents respect, even if they don't deserve it at times. Most of the time, actually. And this dinner is one of those times. Mr. and Mrs. Clark kept asking about her father, whom they knew had gone missing a few years back. What do you think happened to him? Did he intentionally leave you and your mother? You poor souls. How do you get by without the head of your family? They kept prodding. Brooklyn tried to divert the topic, but when the old couple refused to be deterred and kept firing question after question, she answered evasively and just smiled at them, at whatever they said. Noah's parents thought that perhaps the reason why Brooklyn's father went missing all of a sudden was because he was running away from debts. They didn't want Brooklyn for Noah because she's poor, and even more so because they didn't want to be associated with her or her family's chaos. We don't know if one day some thugs will come knocking at our door demanding payment for what our daughter-in-law's father owes them. No, I can't accept that, Mrs. Clark said one night. Don't worry, dear, I won't let that happen, Mr. Clark said confidently. So at this dinner, the old couple are doing everything they can to embarrass Brooklyn, so much so that she'll finally break up with Noah. Mrs. Clark kept hurling disguised insults at Brooklyn, which hurt her feelings. Even if she continuously tells herself that she can and will endure this treatment for Noah, Brooklyn's calm facade is almost at its breaking point. She did reach her limit though, when Mrs. Clark called attention to the fact that she doesn't know how to eat the exotic dishes placed on her plate. In an attempt to embarrass Brooklyn, Mrs. Clark, who never once used the massive kitchen to cook a meal for herself or her family, ordered several exotic dishes to show Brooklyn how different they are. Unbeknownst to Brooklyn, Mrs. Clark didn't know what they were, or how to eat them either. But she pretended to know and loudly embarrassed Brooklyn in front of the guests. Oh dear, if I'd known you aren't keen on such dishes, I wouldn't have had the maids give you that. I forgot that you've never seen or tasted food that we rich people usually eat, Mrs. Clark said condescendingly. Fed up, Brooklyn slowly stood up and with unshed tears in her eyes, said, I'm sorry, but I have to leave. Please excuse me. Seeing that she finally got under Brooklyn's skin, Mrs. Clark said, We haven't had dessert yet, but if you really have to go, and trailed off, implying that it doesn't matter if she stays or goes. Brooklyn walked towards the door with her back straight, dignified, before she let her tears race down her face when she was outside. Noah excused himself from the table and went after Brooklyn. I'm sorry for Mom, Brooke. Let's go. I'll take you home. No, it's fine. You can't leave yet. There are guests in there, Brooklyn answered. Besides, I want to feel the night air on my skin and walk under the moonlight. I'll be fine. Go back inside." Noah, who had no choice but to respect her wishes, brushed a kiss on Brooklyn's cheeks and watched her disappear into the night. Once inside, Noah held his temper. When the guests finally left, he faced his parents. "Did you really have to do that?" "What? I did nothing," said Mr. Clark. "I didn't do anything. I shouldn't have done either," answered Mrs. Clark. "You both know what I'm talking about. You know that I love Brooke and I'll never break up with her no matter what you say," Noah said, almost shouting. "With the way she left, you're good as broken up anyway," huffed Mrs. Clark before her husband said, "Son, money goes with money. I've already found a girl more suited to you than that poor girl." Realizing that there was no getting through to his parents, Noah stormed out of the house, frustrated. On a shadowy corner of a street, Noah saw a homeless man settling in for the night. Fishing a bill out of his pocket, he gave the man money before going on his way. He always does this whenever he sees homeless people. He wanted to share the privilege he enjoys with the less fortunate. The man, on the other hand, was a bit surprised by the kind gesture, but grateful nonetheless. As he was about to sleep, using newspaper clippings as a blanket, he saw something that jolted him awake. There was a picture of a missing man, but it was his face that he saw. Before he could think about it or its implication, he clutched his head in agony before losing consciousness. Noah, walking slowly to clear off his head, heard the thump and saw the homeless man slumped in the corner. He immediately called 911 and went to the hospital with him. There, the man regained his consciousness, along with his memory. He was the man in the picture. He was Frank, an astute businessman widely known in his circle before he was hit in the head one day 3 years ago while on his way home after closing a deal with a prestigious firm. More than that, he was Frank, Brooklyn's father. Noah called Brooklyn as well as his parents to let them know what happened on his walk. Upon entering the hospital room, Mr. and Mrs. Clark's faces were drained of color when they saw Frank chatting happily with his wife and daughter, with Noah on Brooklyn's side. They both stood frozen at the door, and when Frank's eyes landed on them, they slowly backed out. Although curious about the couple's odd behavior, Brooklyn decided not to pay them any mind. All that matters now is her father, who's finally back with them. Meanwhile, Mr. and Mrs. Clark sat unmoving inside their car, still not believing what they just saw. "Tell me I'm dreaming," Mr. Clark muttered. "What will happen to us now?" Mrs. Clark said hysterically. Apparently Frank and Mr. Clark knew each other before. However, Mr. Clark had always been jealous of Frank's seemingly innate business smarts, so he and his wife planned to get him out of his way, so to speak. One afternoon, when Frank was on his way home after closing a much-coveted deal with a huge and well-known firm, he saw a car on the side of the road and recognized it as Mr. Clark's. "Is there a problem?" he asked as he rolled down his window. "It seems like there's a problem with the engine, but I'm not entirely sure as I don't have much idea about cars," Mr. Clark immediately answered. Mrs. Clark stayed inside the car unseen. Frank, known as someone always willing to lend a hand to those in need, didn't hesitate and got out of the car, popped the hood, and leaned in to check what could be wrong. It was then that he was struck with something on the side of the head, saw Mrs. Clark with something in her hand with his blood on it before he was enveloped by darkness. Mr. and Mrs. Clark smirked to themselves as they drove away from Frank. "I told you it'd be easy to dupe that man. He's too good for his own good," said Mr. Clark, while Mrs. Clark is happily counting all the money they got from Frank's car. Suffice it to say that there was a lot, especially since he'd just closed a deal with a big client. What the two didn't know was that a passing car, coincidentally lost, was driving slowly trying to find out how to get out of this long stretch of road. The driver saw Frank lying on one side of the road with blood gushing from the side of his head. He called 911 and waited for the ambulance to come before he went on his way. When Frank awoke a few days later, he had no knowledge of what happened. He didn't even know who he was, where he was, or why he was there. When he got out of the hospital, he had no idea where to go or what to do. At first, he stayed at shelters, but there were days that it is too full to accommodate him. That was when he ended up sleeping on the streets, and has been doing so until the day Noah found him. Now, Frank's wife stayed at his bedside at all times while Brooklyn divided her time between school and the hospital. Noah would always go with her whenever she came to visit her father. One day, Frank told his wife and daughter with Noah present what happened to him. When he was done, tears were falling from the women's faces while Noah couldn't seem to look up as he bowed his head out of shame. He didn't know his parents were this greedy to hurt a person. "I'm really sorry, sir. On behalf of my parents, I sincerely apologize," said Noah in a broken voice. "No, son, come here." Frank motioned him closer. "Look me in the eye and listen to me. You don't have to be sorry. It's your parents' fault, not yours. Just continue to love and care for my daughter, and that's good enough for me." Brooklyn went to Noah's side as she held her father's hand. When he was well enough, Frank sued Mr. and Mrs. Clark for what they did. They basically robbed him of 3 years of his life, not to mention that they killed him, except he didn't die. Despite this, Frank, who believes that sin is not inherited from one's parents, approves of Brooklyn and Noah's relationship as the boy is nothing like his parents. In fact, he walked Brooklyn down the aisle when the young couple got married a year later. Noah cut his ties with his parents, who never, not once, showed remorse for what they did. Noah and Brooklyn now live a few blocks away from her parents' house, and they always made time to visit them. That's how a family should be. 5 years later, after picking up their 3-year-old daughter from her grandparents, Brooklyn's parents, Noah saw a letter in the mail. It was from his parents, reaching out to him after 5 years. With Sophia in his arms and the letters tightly clutched in his hands, Noah entered his home, where his wife was waiting for them, baking in the kitchen. Inside, he let Sophia play in her playpen, went to Brooklyn, and wordlessly handed her the letter. Brooklyn looked at Noah's blank expression as she picked up the envelope. When she saw Mr. and Mrs. Clark's name as the sender, she worriedly looked at her husband, whom she knew was hurt by his parents' cold shoulder, especially after what happened, although he tried to hide it. To be fair, he was coddled by his parents, even before they did what they did to her father, so she knew how close he was with his parents. It was for this very reason that Noah harbored hate towards his parents. He didn't know they were capable of doing such a horrid thing. Now they are reaching out to him after years of no contact. Noah didn't know what to do. Aware of the storm going on in her husband's head, Brooklyn silently went to his side, hugged him close, and murmured, "Whatever you decide to do, I'll support you. We're family now. My parents would understand your decision, whatever it may be." Noah enveloped Brooklyn in his arms, grateful for having such a lovely and understanding wife. "I'll think about it. We will think about it," he said.